Okay, everybody, well, welcome. Thanks for coming. Today's going to be a Q&A session. I did have some questions given to me in advance, and I'm going to deal with those first and foremost. But I'm also, depending on how much time we take on those, I will deal with some questions on the fly. But the questions that were raised in advance actually touched on some really big issues. So I'm definitely going to give those a fair amount of attention, because these are really big issues which impact most people, whether they know it or not. I think the questions that have been raised will, to some people, be very familiar. So let's just start. And the first question was raised, if I pronounce it correctly, by Laz1, and it was raised in the Mindset channel. And Laz1 said this: I've always struggled with self-confidence. I'm kind of always doubting everything when I make changes in my name and when things go south, and sometimes end up questioning basics which I thought I'd mastered. I feel like one of the underlying issues is fear of failure. It feels really bad to be in front of a wall, and the only thing that makes sense to us is to accept defeat. Have you noticed fear of failure being a recurring issue? How to deal with it? I also believe it could be a game approach issue. What would you emphasize to have a healthy approach to the game? So to answer the first broad question, is that something that I've come across as a recurring issue, fear of failure? Yes. And fear in a very general sense is a massively occurring issue. In fact, I would say it is the biggest issue I deal with as a performance and mindset coach, fear. And I'm going to come back to where this fear is coming from in a minute. And it actually also occurs in another point that I saw raised in the Mindset channel. The answer is that fear is often a freestanding subconscious emotional component to what people feel when they're playing. I'm going to come to that in much more detail and where it comes from. But I do want to start by emphasizing that the feeling of confidence, which I suppose is the polar opposite to fear, has to be, it has to be built on firm foundations technically. So the starting point here is that I, as a performance and mindset coach, cannot trick your mind into believing that you are confident and that you should be free of fear if the reality is that you do not have the technical foundations, because our brain cannot completely bullshit itself. There are going to be spots where if you have not done the hard technical work to get your game up to scratch, your brain is going to recognize that, wait a minute, I don't know what I'm doing here. And no amount of clever words, even through hypnotherapy, by the way, which we will come to, none of that is on its own going to completely paper over the cracks of inadequacy at a technical level. So it's really, really important to just make sure that your technical foundations are in place. Now, the question from Laz says, look, even the basics that I thought I'd mastered, sometimes when I'm feeling this feeling of fear, I'm starting to doubt that. And again, that is something which has a freestanding component at a subconscious level. And that's something we definitely need to tackle technically. But one thing I would say is it's interesting how often I get players who come to me and will say, I'm doubting my game. And we look into particular spots, and I ask them to clarify what their thought process is in a particular spot. And I'll even go through hand histories with them, having played myself. And it's interesting. I will then test them as to how clear their thought processes are in this spot. And it's really often the case that people are not quite as clear as they think they are. They will have sat in coaching sessions. They'd have kind of digested the lesson, but what they won't have done is then taken it a step further and truly integrated it through deliberate practice. And this is just something I want to really emphasize. And this is the importance of deliberate practice in really making sure that your concepts are integrated. So this is more than sitting in a coaching session and taking notes. I think pretty well everybody knows that, it's not enough to simply just turn up to a coaching and listen to somebody and go away saying, yeah, I kind of got that. But the next level is to take notes. But that in itself is still not enough. And what I strongly recommend, and it's worked with highest level players in the world, is the creation of heuristics. In other words, you go to a coaching session or you watch a video, and you take notes, but then you turn that into something which is simplified and which you can use as an in-game thought process. So this is what a heuristic is all about. And the truth of the matter is, as humans, we use heuristics all the time. We might think that we're thinking with all the complexity and all of the factors, but our brain automatically defaults to the use of heuristics, which is a simplification. It has to try and simplify a million factors. And a lot of those factors will be pretty irrelevant, if not completely irrelevant. So the idea of a heuristic is a good one. It reduces the cognitive load on the brain, and particularly in a format like you guys are playing, there is not a heck of a lot of time to bring a million thought processes and a million factors into a decision. You need to have some simplifications. So the way I deal with heuristics is to teach people to create mind maps. Now, mind maps is great for people who are visual learners, but it's basically a flow chart. You will ask yourself a series of questions to reach a decision, and you can reinforce that on a spaced repetition basis with a tool like Anki. And then what I've been doing now in the last year or so with a lot of the players I'm working with, and it's had real success, is in these spots where they're feeling like they lose confidence or they are feeling an emotional interference with their decision-making process, we will turn that mind map into something which they rehearse through hypnotherapy. We'll reinforce it at a subconscious level. So we will get their brain to feel calm, and they will visualize themselves in these spots going through that process. And I'll for some of those players, I've recorded a custom hypnotherapy track so that they can go through it every day. It reinforces the technical learning process, but it also reinforces a state of mind of calm and confidence. And, so that they actually not just know the actual technical process, but they also then reinforce that with a calm state of mind, which means that in game, they're speaking to themselves in a very calm way when they apply the process. So all of that, you might think, well, wait a minute, what's that got to do with confidence? Well, it's about saying, don't just assume that because you've gone to a coaching session dealing with a particular issue, and even if you've paid attention to it, don't just assume that you really have it integrated. You have to go a lot further to truly integrate that knowledge, and deliberate practice is proven as a way of really integrating knowledge. And then I've given you a couple of techniques, and I can talk about this in a lot more detail, but it's not the main point of the question. That is going to then enable your subconscious mind to feel much more reassured. When I started off in this job, a lot of the hypnotherapy I saw, and even I practiced, frankly, myself, was just hypnotherapy which said, okay, just be calm, be confident. And that definitely helps to some degree, that sort of basic suggestion of being calm and confident. But your brain is going to feel a lot more calm and confident if it says, well, okay, what's the plan? And you're able to say, here is a clear plan. So, imagine you were in a dark and dangerous forest and I was right next to you, and I just said, okay, be calm, be cool, be confident. You might like my reassuring words, but you may feel a little less reassured if you then ask me, well, what's the plan? And that's the way your mind is going to work. If you just try and turn around to your subconscious mind and say, I haven't got a plan. The subconscious mind will say, well, don't tell me to be calm, because I can't be calm without a plan. I need to feel that. So what I'm doing here with this process I've described is really integrating the knowledge at a technical level, at a conscious level, but reinforcing it at a subconscious level. So that's something I would really emphasize to think about. How many of these spots where you start to feel self-doubt, can you truly say that I have a very clear heuristic? Sure, even if you apply that heuristic, poker being what it is, sometimes you will just not win. That's just the nature of it. Sometimes you'll hit the top of somebody's range in a spot where the correct line is to bluff. But it's going to feel a lot more reassuring for your subconscious mind if you can say, hey, this is fine. Because in fact, one of the things I would do at a subconscious level, for example, in that spot, is to reinforce the reality that if you execute a certain line, for example, a bluffing line, you don't have to win every time. You will accept that it's a probabilistic play that is plus EV, and that part of probabilistic plays is that you won't win all of the time. You don't need to. So that's really important. The next thing I'm going to talk about before we talk about the sort of subconscious, the pure subconscious aspect of fear of failure, is poker and its role in relation to your broader life. Because when we talk about how we feel about poker when things are going badly, one thing I've really noticed is, and this is very true in poker, is that some players definitely do not have enough going on in their life outside poker, and it can be an issue. I've been dealing with a high stakes cash game player recently who's had a real dip in confidence, and then we actually talked about what was going on in his life, and the answer was nothing. Poker was the only thing which for him was defining his success. And so when poker wasn't going well, he felt like his life was a failure, and that's a really tough feeling. And one of the things we did was we actually very actively looked to build broader aspects of his life, social life, relationships. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have a relationship or you have to be, regularly going out and doing a whole load of other stuff. But if your focus on poker is very much it and all about it for your life, that I would say is something that you need to review. By all means, put in good hours, but you need to have somewhere where you can pursue other interests which feel good, which are important to you, because you're much more likely to feel the pain of a downswing if poker is all there is, because that is all you're judging your life by. So the next thing I'm just going to talk about in relation to this issue is what we want to do is we want to build a baseline level of calm in our life. And this is where practices like having a really good morning routine, a really good pre-game routine, really good sleep are important. And if I was to recommend one body to mind practice, which will basically calm your nervous system and make you much less inclined to move into a sort of fight, flight, or freeze mode, I would recommend breath work. Hypnotherapy is also extremely good as a pre-game routine. And as we'll come to in a minute, it's really good at tackling the underlying causes of a lack of confidence and fear. But the best body to mind practice I would recommend is breath work. And the simple kind of breath work I would recommend most of all would be a 4 in, 6 out breath. There's lots and lots of evidence out there about different types of breath work. The physiological sigh is a really good proven technique. And that's basically where you breathe in for 4 or something like 4. And near the top of that breath, you breathe in again. And then you have a longer out breath. But my favorite remains the simple resonant breath, 4 in, 6 out, or something like that. It may be 3 in, 5 out for you. That is going to calm your nervous system. And when you calm your nervous system, these emotions like fear are going to be less prevalent. Just one final thing to mention just on the subject of fear and sort of stress and anxiety in game. In isolation, a little bit of fear is not a bad thing. A lot of the public health messaging around anxiety and stress is it's something to be resisted. And that's definitely true with chronic stress. It's extremely unhealthy to be chronically stressed. But if you feel a little bit of stress and anxiety, say at the beginning of a session, or maybe in a particular game, it may be, I don't know, a large multiplier or something, or it's a particularly difficult opponent, that is not of itself a bad thing. Because the evidence is that when we enter a flow state, the opening seconds of that flow state, there is autonomic arousal. That thing that we often recognize as a little bit of fear, a little bit of anxiety, is actually a gateway to high performance. It's then a case of how we frame that. Now, that is a matter of mental game training. That's something I work on a lot with people, because what we also know is that autonomic arousal can send us down the route of choking. But it can, and it is something that can be used beneficially to actually enhance performance. This is why a lot of top sports people have this framing of, pressure is a privilege, or I'm excited. I'm not nervous, I'm excited. Or even if they talk about nerves, it's like these nerves are a good thing. And it's true. It turns out the evidence supports them, that flow states actually arise when you have that little bit of autonomic arousal. So one thing to be aware of is a little bit of fear can be a good thing, but we also do need to deal with the more fundamental problem that Laz identifies here, which is super common, which is this, particularly if this is something that extends over a period of time, in a downswing, oh my God, I'm feeling like I'm losing confidence. I have a fear of failure. What's going to happen? And really, there is often a subconscious basis to this. And this will often go back way before you were ever playing poker. And in my experience, the most powerful way of addressing this, because it is a subconscious program, is through hypnotherapy, because it is a modality of therapy, which is, coaching, if you like, which is directed specifically at the subconscious. You cannot just use logic, because indeed, one of the things that Laz is saying is, look, there's parts of my game which I thought I'd mastered, and then I end up feeling this lack of confidence. It's not logic that's going to help you get out of this, because what's happening in this situation is our brain isn't being logical. It's exaggerating the fears. And that's a reflection of something we will talk about more later in this session, which is the fact that our subconscious mind is really a fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. It's been around for hundreds of thousands of years. It kept us alive. It still serves some purpose, even in the modern world. Just every now and then, we might need to act quickly to save ourselves. We might be crossing a road and only at the last minute see a car traveling. We need a system which quickly acts and pulls us back onto the pavement before we're hit. That's still useful, but it's not useful in a lot of modern contexts. But that part of our brain is so powerful, and it's designed to act quickly, that it often overrides our conscious logic. And it's something that needs to be trained, and you can train it specifically through hypnotherapy. If anybody's wanting evidence around this, have a look at the work of Dr. David Spiegel, who's a psychiatrist. He's a practicing psychiatrist as well as an academic at Stanford University. And using modern brain scanning techniques, he and his team at Stanford were able to identify the fact that the actual structures of the brain, the neural pathways, were changed beneficially using hypnotherapy. So this is where we need to work out where these issues have come from, and using specifically regression therapy to identify where these memories, because they usually are memories which have resulted in patterns of behavior. If somebody gets a sense of fear, which is very, very strong, it usually comes from something going way back. And regression is the most powerful way of actually going back and finding the initial sensitizing event which has caused this. And it will have been reinforced multiple times down the years. And this is very much a work in progress. But this work will make a huge difference to underlying patterns of fear, specifically fear of failure, but any kind of fear, and confidence. And there's other types of therapy which are also extremely powerful in resolving this. Within the broad umbrella of hypnotherapy, I use parts therapy as well. But those, specifically the subconscious element is really, really important here. It usually does underlie the problem. As I say, it's really vital that you still have your technical foundations in place. And it's also important to do other things, like I've suggested, have a broader life so that poker isn't everything. Do breath work. Other things are beneficial as well. Exercise will be beneficial. But definitely tackling the root cause of an exaggerated emotional response is going to be really important. Otherwise, you're always kind of papering over the cracks. And hypnotherapy, attacking the subconscious causes, is going to be the best way of doing that. So I don't know whether Laz is here, but oh, yes, he is. Or he, yes, it is he, Tristan. Does that answer your question, Laz, or is there anything else you wanted to say on that? Okay, it's answered your question. Cool. So yes, I would highly recommend, looking into the question of dealing with the subconscious. Here's the interesting thing. I mean, I definitely benefited from the regression therapy. And the interesting thing is, it doesn't just deal with poker issues. It kind of reduces anxiety, it reduces fearfulness in other aspects of your life. So it's really beneficial. Okay. Alex has raised a question, and he's really wants me to revisit the issue of whether or not to look at graphs. Okay. There's been quite a bit of debate on this. And I just want to start by framing this. I think it's important that everybody, when we have this discussion, steps back and moves from an anecdotal to a scientific approach, because it was a scientific approach which led me to say what I said about this. And the evidence on a scientific basis is very, very clear. Look at Dr. Rick Hanson, psychologist. And he has this great phrase which really summarizes the position. He talks about the human mind being Teflon for positivity and Velcro for negativity. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winning psychologist, has also noted the tendency of the human mind to attach itself much more to negative events than positive events. So the question is, why does that happen? Well, it comes back to that fight, flight, or freeze evolutionary system, which I've already referred to. In evolutionary terms, it's far more important to be aware of dangers, be aware of the bad news, as opposed to the good news. The good news is fine, but it's not something for the brain to get particularly worried or focused on, because if everything's going okay, we can relax. But the brain will focus on bad news. So with that in mind, you might say, well, okay, what's that got to do with EV? Well, again, this part of our brain is always operating, and it hasn't got much to worry about in existential terms in 2023, but it will still focus on what we're doing. And if what we're doing is playing poker, it will be applying its own rather simplistic logic to what we're doing. This is one of the great things that Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow illustrated. We think as humans, we are very smart and that we're capable of calibrating to our environment in a very logical way. But basically, Kahneman's book, all of his work, Tversky, Kahneman, illustrates that cognitive biases such as affect bias, which is the way emotions affect us in a moment and impact on our decision-making, are prevalent all the time. So one of the things that will happen is if you're checking EV in game, for example, you'll firstly, it's illogical to assume that you can derive anything of useful information from that. The sample size will always be meaningless. So if you think if it's telling you you're playing great, you're very probably wrong, or you're very possibly wrong. Certainly you're not reliably correct. And the same if it's giving you bad news. But the real problem is that if it's giving you bad news, it will make you feel bad. It will impact on your emotions. So checking EV is just a negative free roll because it's giving you no concrete, helpful information. Checking EV in game, this is. And it's probably just interfering with your emotions. Either way, and it's unhelpful because it's not giving you reliable information. Now, nobody is saying never check EV. I'm just saying do so when it's meaningful. Do so when you've got a sample size, which will help you understand something about your game. You know, am I playing well? Am I playing badly? Now, I've seen some people deal with this issue by asking people who really want to keep looking at their EV saying, how do I know if I'm playing well or badly? Well, as I say, fine, check it definitely outside a session, but check it when there's a sample size which is meaningful. It makes no sense to look at it when the sample size is too small. It's far more meaningful to check for frequency statistics, particularly if they are sufficient to give you an indication, you know, as to whether you really are playing that spot correctly, and then filter for those hands and look as to whether you're playing that spot. You know, but definitely don't have this all or nothing rationalization to keep looking. Well, if I don't look at my EV stats, I don't know if I'm playing well or badly. That's just nonsense. That's just an excuse to keep looking. What we might as well be honest about it. If that's what we're doing, we just want that kick, that feeling of I'm looking at it to make me feel better. Unfortunately, as I say, the positive effect of looking at it to make you feel better doesn't work. It's a negative free roll. You know, if it's not going as well as you think, you will feel that pain. It will have a far bigger effect on your emotions negatively than it will positively. But if you are looking at it, it is positive. It's probably misleading you because sample size over certainly, you know, a session, and people will definitely be people who check their EV in a session. It's utterly meaningless. So why do it? You might as well just say, hey, I like drinking sugary drinks, so I'm going to do it. It doesn't actually help me play better poker, but I just like the feeling of it. And that's the same with this. Just admit it's a habit. It's a little bit of an addiction, but don't try and pretend it's actually got a beneficial effect. It's anecdotal when you say that. I've heard people say, oh, it motivates me. Well, you know, as I say, there'll be people who will say that sugary drinks give them energy. Well, they do, but there's much better ways of getting energy. Just do what you need to do to actually play well. You will honestly, I mean, you know, look, I remember speaking to a guy, some of you guys will be aware of him. I think he might still be playing, Cogdis. And I always loved what he said when he was reviewing a session. I was in a coaching session with him back in the days when I was playing spins. And he said to somebody, in fact, I think it was a live sweat, as I recall, and he said, you know, why are you looking at that? Whatever answers you're looking for, they're not there. The guy clicked on, you know, his EV, you know, as if to sort of say, okay, you know, here's how it's going. It's true. The answers are not there, certainly within a session. That's the thing I would discourage most. But it really doesn't help you that much to look at it if the sample size is small, even at the end of a session. Far better to check on your frequencies, far better to check on whatever your coach has been working on or whatever you've been working on. Am I playing that spot correctly? If you know that, for example, you're not pulling the trigger enough in bluffing spots on the river or in river bluff catching spots, filter those hands, work through them. That's far more beneficial than just looking at your EV in a vacuum, particularly when the sample size is small. So I know there's been a lot of controversy on this issue, and I can see that, you know, people who I know have been discussing this are here. Anybody want to say anything to that?
Yeah, maybe I say a couple of things because the question was also from me.
Yeah.
Totally get it, right? I know it's 100% true that we shouldn't look at TV. You said it's like a little bit of an addiction, and I think it's actually a lot like an addiction. For example, I quit stopping like a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And there your mind will trick you. It will talk to you and give you reasons why you should watch it. And I had it just now, like today or yesterday, I don't know. Like I actually didn't want it to look at the results, but somehow my mind like got me into it. Like I don't know how, but then it was like, yeah, okay, now it makes sense. You know what I mean? Like it is totally illogical, but still, yeah, it's as if it's some kind of like withdrawal symptoms. It sounds weird, but it is a little bit like this.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's interesting the way the subconscious mind is so powerful. It will actually recruit the conscious mind to come up with rationalizations for doing something. Now, I'll give you some extreme examples, and some of the people who might maybe still not be persuaded of the logic of what I'm saying may say, oh, it's not the same, it's different. Of course, that's ridiculous. But I'm going to give you two examples, one of which was given by the person who, one of my original tutors in hypnotherapy. But the first one I'm going to give you is from a client I had in poker, cash game player, well established, but had a series of bad beats. Basically in bluffing spots where he pulled the trigger quite correctly, in a bluffing hotspot, and got snapped off. And he got snapped off, I can't remember, 3, 4, 5 times in big pots. And he stopped playing. He was out of the game for months, and then he came to see me. We got him back in the game. But what his mind was telling him, his conscious mind was telling him, was that it was basically, you need to study more. You need to study more before you get back playing. And it's nonsense, of course. He just hit the top of, well, firstly, he hit the top of some players' ranges, and secondly, there was some players who just were calling too widely, and it was just one of those things. It was just one of those statistical clusters which came together when he was doing the right thing, but he got the wrong results. He didn't need to study more than he was already studying. But what was happening is his subconscious mind was, in pain because of those situations. And it was saying, I don't like it. And it was basically suborning his conscious mind to come up with reasons which were more rational. And the supposedly rational reason was, well, I need to get better. There was nothing wrong with his game. He was like, he was massively plus EV in the games he was playing, but that was a very painful period. That's an example in poker of the way the subconscious mind subverts the conscious mind to come up with reasons to justify a particular behavior. The person who was one of the people who taught me hypnotherapy, she actually got into hypnotherapy to give up smoking herself originally. And she lived in New York, and she worked in the financial district. And she basically came up with this logic, which was she needed to smoke to look tougher so that she would be safer in New York. Right? So that's just clear bullshit, right? You are not safer as a woman in New York because you're holding a cigarette. But it was basically her subconscious wanted her to stay smoking because it felt comforting. It turned out really that the original reason for this was she wanted to be part of the crowd. She got into smoking at school to be part of the gang. And ever since then, it became a comfort blanket. She didn't need that level of comfort and friendship in the way she did at school. She didn't have that same insecurity, but she still had a feeling that this was a place of comfort and safety. But see again, the way that her subconscious basically twisted her conscious mind into believing something which just wasn't true. And these are patterns which you see all the time. People will try and come up with reasons why they need to, and their conscious mind will start saying, yeah, well, okay, I need to know if I'm playing well. Am I playing well? And that will be the reason to slip back into a particular habit. But the reality is it's bullshit. The only real way to tackle that again is we come back to the point in the first question. We want to tackle the underlying patterns, because what it boils down to is usually it's a feeling of lack of confidence. It's a desire for control. You're looking for validation in that EV. That's what's happening. You're looking for validation, but it's just premature validation. It's incomplete validation. because with a small sample size, it's meaningless. By all means, I think a good EV, a positive EV over a good sample is something you can and should draw on. And it's something, for example, I do work with players in downswings, and we'll talk about their EV. We'll look at their statistics, and if they are stacking up, then it's something you can leverage in a very positive way. So that's part of the logic that you use to reassure your subconscious mind that playing poker is a good thing. But people are looking for that on a far too frequent and far too short-term basis with incomplete statistical samples. So yeah, does that help, Alex?
Yeah, of course. There's just like another thing, like it's way more like quote unquote painful.
Yeah.
If you take a look after a month and the results are like bad, then having it like slowly, that you know, like from session to session, it's just like a small chunk of bad feeling.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not really like I had like a very bad experience, like where I had like a massive challenge where I wanted to rake like a lot, and I played like 20 days for 12 hours with the toughest players in the world, and then I got the results from the 20 days, and basically I got crushed because I was not used to play so many tables for so many hours with the best, right? And this was really painful, and I needed to give up this like huge challenge, and like I actually couldn't look at the results because I didn't have access to it. It was on Party Poker.
Yeah.
And after that, it was like I needed like quite a lot of time to get back to confidence, etc., because I got like a big hit. And I don't know, like my subconscious probably tried to tell me that one of the reasons I performed bad, or why I kept playing so long, was because I couldn't see the results, basically, right? So maybe I could have quit earlier, because it was also quite a big financial hit, basically, right? And then like nowadays it doesn't make any sense, because like even the stakes, I play mainly stakes that I also teach, just to be like that I know what's going on in the pools, etc. And like I don't need take a look at the results, but I'm still like kind of like want to, just to, I don't know, it doesn't make any sense, but I guess that's one of the reasons why for me personally I kind of feel the urge to look, just to not be like negatively surprised after like a big time, or maybe I also think that maybe I go a little bit faster into autopilot mode. But that's probably also, you can avoid it with like proper warm-ups, etc., and session goals, deliberate playing, etc. So I think that's also just some kind of excuse, I guess.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, I mean, okay, I can think of a cash game player, and he plays like three max. He plays sort of three max. He plays five max, and he also plays heads up, and he mixes his formats sometimes, and he would often sort of have small sample sizes and draw conclusions from those about whether it was a good idea to play a particular game, a mix of games, and so on. But if somebody has a really small sample size, I would honestly say in that situation, the better way of assessing whether you're playing well, for example, particularly where you're talking about table count, is, well, look, subjectively, how do you feel in terms of the time you've got to make the decisions? Do you feel like you are making good decisions and with enough time, or are you feeling constantly hurried? Because some people might say, oh, well, that's subjective. How does that help? But I would say an extremely small sample size doesn't help either. You're pinning a sort of scientific validity on something which doesn't have scientific validity. And if somebody says, look, I know I'm hurrying my decisions when I've got a certain table count, then I would say, right, fine. When you need to alter that, you kind of know. I knew when I was playing too many tables, I had to reduce my table count. You don't need to wait necessarily to get to a certain sample size to just simply say, okay, right, well, I now know that I have been playing badly. But equally, you can end up just, let's say you do increase your table count by a small amount, and you sort of halfway to getting a decent sample size, log on to your EV and say, oh, wait a minute, it's not that good. It may be a really premature judgment. You may be getting out of there when you actually probably could increase your table count. So I honestly think in that situation, it is far better to rely on something else. Sure, once you get a decent sample size, and if it's if it's a much poorer result, a significantly poorer result, then you need to look again. And, obviously before increasing table count or before increasing states, you need to make sure that you're properly bankrolled and you've properly thought things through. But I would not be logging on to my, I wouldn't be going into my database to get that information really quickly. But if I knew I was being pushed in terms of my decision making by increasing table count, then I would be much more inclined to listen to that. Does that help, Alex?
Yeah, of course. Also think it's probably like you kind of have to train to not look, right? So it's like it's like quitting smoking. Like the first 10 days, it's hard, but after that, it's getting easy. And after like, I don't know, 2-3 months, it's just like second nature, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like look, it's like social media on your phone. These things become a little bit addictive, and I'm afraid looking at your EV can be addictive. And it's also, just by the way, it is also increasing your cognitive load in session for sure. It's just a piece of information your brain does not want or does not need to deal with.
I think sometimes it's also players, even if they don't look at the results, they think about the results, right? So there's actually no difference. Like I think, oh, that's a bad session, etc. Even though it's just like we need to focus on our decisions and the other things we can't control, but still you think about it. And sometimes I think people think when they just watch very quickly, they get rid of these feelings. Okay, so they know now, okay, it's bad, and then they can go on. Maybe that might be one of the reasons why people are looking. But yeah, should we force, or should we try to like to get better thoughts? Like how do we do that? Because it's pretty hard to control these kind of things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to let Julianne.
Yeah, please. Sorry.
You can unmute yourself, Julianne. Hi, Julianne.
Hey, Stephen.
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you as well. So my position on this checking graph has historically been to look at it every single time you feel the need to.
Yeah.
And then I decided, based on your work and based on the more general advice from the mindset chat, to stop looking at it for a meaningful sample of 4,000, 5,000 hands.
Yeah.
And what I discovered by not looking at the graph, I was getting feedback, and I was getting more meaningful feedback from my emotions about how I was feeling about certain aspects. Yeah. And at some point before getting to complete this, I had a very strong feeling that, hey, something is off with my game. Yeah. And then I checked, and then something was indeed off with my game. So I think that's something I would have missed if I would have to look insistently at the graphs after every single session.
Yeah.
And simply, I want to say it's just a bad habit and an addiction. And what I was doing is I was screening for outliers. Basically, I was telling myself, like, I want to see if my win rate over, let's say, 300, 400 games is low enough or high enough, so then I can get some form of feedback of where my real win rate is. I was looking for essentially clarity, or looking for certainty, or I would be screening for red line because I wanted to see, well, am I active enough? Am I passive enough? Am I playing okay? So I want to check basically for my performance. I just wanted to know how I'm playing, basically, which it was. And all sorts of, like, I would even make up ideas about, well, I want to know the financial implications of this long streak of sessions. Like, there would be all sorts of, like, the stories I would tell myself to just justify looking at the graph.
Yeah.
And then I yeah, I went through this, I stopped looking, and further I decided that it's really unnecessary to look after each session. It's definitely unnecessary to look in session, but then it's good to look probably every once in a while, like once a week is reasonable for high volume. So I want to thank you for being so compelling in your speech to make me realize that there are better ways to get feedback.
Yeah, I really like what you said, and you actually put it really nicely, because in a sense, this is the trouble. I think what people are doing is they're looking for, as I think I said before, validation, and they're looking for a binary answer. Is everything okay? Am I doing okay? And if it's plus EV, it's like, yeah, I am, great. And if it's minus EV, unfortunately, as I said before, the brain will go, oh, wow, I really don't like that. You're not doing okay. And the truth of the matter is, number one, you may actually be playing okay over a small sample. But also that binary way of looking at it is masking maybe deeper things, which you can be improving your game. And I really like the fact that what you actually gained from this was a greater awareness, a more sophisticated awareness of your game and things that you were finding which will upgrade your game. And those things will be present even when your EV is great, and even when your EV is bad. So there'll be plenty of good things in your game, and there will be other things to look at. So I think by moving away from this, it's just basically an emotional comfort blanket. That's what it is. You know, when people are looking at EV prematurely, certainly in session, as I say, I think it's just a distraction, number one. As I say, it's also a negative emotional free roll. But also away from sessions, before you've got a proper sample, people tend to focus on that. It's the first thing your eyes will go to when you go to your database. You know, what's my EV? And I found personally my game got upgraded when I just, between looking at EV, which was roughly once a month, I actually started focusing on the things my coaches had told me I needed to improve, which were just other frequencies. Now, even there, like, the statistics are not reliable, but what I tended to do was just basically have a report which focused on the things that I needed to improve most. And then I used to filter those hands for certain spots. And yeah, so I think it's great your upgrade. And it's not just that you avoided the negative free roll, but you've actually got some positive learning out of it. You know, it's actually opened you to seeing at a more sophisticated level ways to upgrade your game. Just so thanks for that, Julian. That's really great stuff. I really love the way you've changed, but also you've actually used it as a springboard to really, you know, move on and propel your game to a higher level. And I think that's really, you know, great sophisticated thinking. Tristan Laz says, do you think trusting how we feel the session has gone is a better indicator on how we played? There's definitely bias, but maybe it's better. Well, yeah, I mean, I think to some extent that's probably true. I mean, we know as humans, we kind of fool ourselves all the time, but we also know for sure that a small sample is going to be unreliable. So if you think, wait a minute, you know, especially if you do a post-session review where, for example, this is what, for me, good level study would look like. You've got a coach who's maybe said, hey, watch out for these spots, because I know in these spots you are not doing this enough, or you're doing this too much. And, you know, hopefully in session, you've got an awareness of that, and that will feed into your feelings. Okay, I pulled out of pulling the trigger there again. That's not good. Or no, I pulled the trigger there. Okay, it didn't go to plan, but it's all, you know, I did pull the trigger just like Alex or Cedo, for example, said to me. So I think that can be a more reliable indicator. But one thing I would definitely recommend is, you know, for example, if you've had that kind of coaching and somebody said, hey, you're not doing this enough, my post-session reviews would be along the lines of having filters set up to see what I've done in those spots. Because I definitely found, by the way, when I had that kind of input, it was interesting that when you did that review, you didn't always pull the trigger in the way you thought you had. So I think the real answer is the best short-term way of assessing your session is having an awareness around your weak spots, in particular, doing a post-session review where you filter your hands in that spot and just seeing whether you've applied the logic that you thought you were applying. It's really interesting, that people will often think they've pulled the trigger in a certain situation, but they don't. And that's often a subconscious resistance. So I would say at the top of the hierarchy is that, filtering hands to really scrutinize the spots where from coaching, ideally, you are not doing the right things often enough. The second level down is, yes, just having an awareness of that in game. That's always going to be helpful. If you have that in game, it's going to help you play better throughout the session. And the third level is, well, actually, the third level doesn't even qualify because that is the statistics on EV, which simply do not have a proper sample. I would completely disregard that on a one session basis, or even a relatively small number. But you see, if you're putting in big volume like Julian is, I was doing it over a month. This is a practice I adopted when I played MTTs, and really I needed a month worth of statistics. But if you're putting in big volume like Julian, for example, a week may be fine to look at your EV. You may actually start to get some meaning out of that. So, I don't know the exact statistics and volume, but I do know Julian is playing a pretty big volume. So that may be absolutely fine. At that point, it is worthwhile and it's meaningful, and you can start to get a sense of what you're doing. But yeah, hopefully that helps, Tristan. Feel free to say something if you need a bit more information on that. Anybody else want to say anything on that specific issue? I know it's been the subject of a lot of discussion, but I do think that is a big upgrade. Interesting comment, actually, in the mindset chat. And somebody in there said, how can long-standing professionals have anxiety issues about poker? It must be non-poker issues. That can be true, but it's certainly not necessarily true. Basically, firstly, there is a mistaken assumption that all stress or anxiety is negative. And I've already touched on this. What we actually know now from modern flow psychology is that an element of autonomic arousal, an element of anxiety, what we might perceive ourselves as stress, anxiety, maybe even a little fear, is actually a good thing. What's happening there is our brain is saying to us, this is important, get ready. There's been some great work done by Dr. Alia Crum at Stanford University. She's a psychologist, and basically her understanding is this, and she's basically created a 3-step protocol. And the first step is to understand that when we feel that sense of stress and anxiety, we should actually firstly acknowledge it as being present. It's not something to be resisted in a performance context, a little bit of stress and anxiety, fear. Secondly, we actually should welcome it as basically allowing us to perform at our best. It's our brain giving us a signal that there's a challenge ahead. And the final step is to then turn that into something positive. Now, this is work I do with clients at a conscious level, but I do find that it works most powerfully at a subconscious level, because, reframing that feeling of nerves or stress in game, it's easier said than done. If I just say to you all today, okay, just understand that a little bit of stress, a little bit of anxiety in performance is a good thing, and you can reframe it and understand that it's helping your brain and that it's scientifically proven to be a potential gateway to flow states, I think that will help somewhat. But I think a lot of people would probably think, well, yeah, that's great, but it won't help enough. I will feel too nervous at times, and I won't go into a flow state. I'll actually go the opposite way and I'll perform less well. And that's where reinforcing that thought process through hypnotherapy is a good thing. So in other words, actually saying to the subconscious mind, hey, I'm going to train you to acknowledge this feeling, but understand that it's actually something you can use for higher performance. So, as I say, that's the first thing I would say there, that the presence of anxiety in a long-standing professional is not a sign that something's wrong. On the contrary, it can be just part of their effectively performance ritual. It may not be something they're consciously doing, but it may be something that, you know, is there in their makeup, and it may actually be helping their performance. And there are certainly high-level sports people. I've worked with some of them who are habitually sick, physically sick before games with anxiety. And you might think, oh God, that can't help. And in some ways, it's not a great thing for the body to go through, but it's a sign of, for them, anxiety, and but they can often turn that into a positive. That's an extreme example, but, you know, definitely I would say high level performers, that feeling of anxiety is not uncommon, and it can and often is turned into a way of performing at a high level. The second thing is to say that it is the case that a lot of, in fact, the majority of sources of anxiety are often regressive. In that sense, the comment that was made is true. It's non-poker issues. So when we talk about the issues being regressive, somebody might feel stress in a poker situation, but the original reason why they are more triggered by that goes back to other things that have happened in their life. And the work sort of I do, Elliot Rowe does with his clients, is almost 75% regression work. And what that means is we then try and trace where that anxiety comes from. And if it is excessive, if it is something that overwhelms players, then we'll often find that it goes back often to before when they played poker. It's often a childhood issue. And what's happened is the brain has said, I find this stressful, I'm going to create a certain response. And often that response is maladaptive. A classic example of in an adult, a maladaptive response is alcohol. People will relieve stress through alcohol. There's a childhood issue. I mean, I can think of clients who are very, very uncertain in social situations, and that often is a childhood issue. It's gone back to something that's happened at school, for example. And that's the initial sensitizing cause, but it's then translated into a slightly different context as they get older. So it's actually far from uncommon for professionals to have anxiety issues about poker. And poker can be a trigger, but it's fair to say that often the sources of that anxiety can go back to pre-poker times. But as I say, even then, even acknowledging the presence of anxiety, it's something that you can actually positively use to improve your performance once you have this understanding. By the way, Dr. Alia Crum, she did this amazing study on the impact of the way we frame stress and anxiety. And she took two groups, and there was one group who was showing a video which had lots of negative messaging around stress and anxiety. And then there was a second group who were given lots of positive messaging along the lines that I've outlined, this sort of three-step framing of it as a positive, a warning from your brain or a message from your brain to get ready and to get ready to perform. And they then did tests on the two groups. The group who had the positive framing had higher cognition, better emotional control. And interestingly, even they exhibited a higher level of human growth hormone. So there was something very specific and physiological that was happening in response to this messaging. Their whole mind and body responded positively to this idea that, okay, this is something which is stressful. I'm feeling a little bit of fear, but I can use this. That was an amazing study, and it shows how stress and anxiety can actually be utilized in a very positive way. And as I say, the best way to do this, I will work with clients on saying, okay, where do you feel that? Let's look at the way we frame that situation, and then we'll reinforce it at a subconscious level through hypnotherapy so that the brain is very ready and rehearsed to deal with that situation. So that's just something to be aware of. You know, we are not necessarily looking for a world in which you are completely free of stress and anxiety. That sort of slightly plays into the idea that the public health messaging about chronic stress, as I say, which is correct. But if you feel some element of a little bit of a twinge of nerves when you sit down to start your session, or maybe when you get a really big multiplier, you might say, okay, you know, I shouldn't feel that. I should just feel completely on a plane. But don't worry, you can definitely send that in the right direction. You can actually leverage it. So it's not something to be completely fought against. So yeah, there's a few general thoughts on stress and anxiety. Again, I'd welcome any thoughts on that, or if anybody wants to ask any other questions, please feel free to do so. All quiet. Alex, how do you want to take it from here? We've dealt with some big chunky issues today.
Yeah, maybe give everyone 1 minute to think about something.
Yeah, go for it. I will happily sit back, chill for a minute, have a drink, and everybody can think about any questions they have.
I mean, I could ask you questions the whole day, I think.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, feel free.
I'll let the others think.
Yeah, sure. Can I see a hand? Julian. Go for it, Julian. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I have a question about the flow cycles, more particularly the release phase of the flow cycle.
Yes.
Can you feel that in your body, that you're in a release?
I mean, I personally now have got to the point where certainly it's sort of a combination of body and mind, and it's something you will get used to. I mean, it took me a long time to be absolutely frank, you know, until I really learned about the flow cycle, having studied it. I suppose I fell into a patterns that a lot of people fell into, which was work, you know, and sit at your desk until you finished. And then what I've now found is this conscious, I'm actually put it in my diary, and, you know, to actually go and effectively move and walk. You know, I basically walk after every session I do with a client. I go for a walk. I deliberately try and create space between sessions, and I actually feel relaxed, and I can almost feel my brain just going into a more relaxed mode. That's where you really feel it. Your mind tends to just become more relaxed, and then yeah, you can sometimes feel that in your body. Mind and body tend to be extremely closely related on this. You know, I know it's a challenge for people to, you know, particularly if you're putting in a lot of volume, to really leverage the release phase of the flow cycle to the max. I mean, for people who, I suppose I should, in fairness to anybody who's here who's not aware of the flow cycle. I mean, the flow cycle is a concept from flow psychology. The study of flow psychology has really come on a heck of a lot since Mihai Csikszentmihalyi first identified the idea that we could actually manipulate ourselves in a way which would make us more likely to go into a state of flow. And basically, the science has identified there are 4 phases to the flow cycle. There is struggle. This is where we do the hard, concentrated work, which will install the knowledge in our brain. It's like a loading phase. It will install the knowledge in our brain, which we access when we're in a flow state. You know, in other words, you don't just get into a flow state out of nothing. You can't produce high performance without doing the great work. So that for you guys will often be really detailed study. You might be drilling certain lines, your pre-flop ranges. You want to be able to just rely on a deep knowledge automatically. There is an automation. It's not a bad thing to have an element of autopilot. That's kind of what happens in a flow state, albeit that your brain in critical decisions can be much more creative. there's that stage. Now, what then comes after that hard work where your brain will be in a beta brainwave state, highly concentrated, is the release phase. And that's what Julian just referred to. And what happens in the release phase is your brain, you want to put your brain into a relaxed brainwave state. So often maybe an alpha state, a theta state. And what we know is that that enables us to come back to a much more powerful, high performing state later. We'll come to that because the next phase is the flow state phase. But it also actually consolidates knowledge. So one of the things that happens is that your brain effectively continues to work on solutions, even though you're no longer actively thinking about them. So the best example of this might be you go and do an hour and a half study, and you then go for a walk. Something light and physical is what you need in the release phase. Not looking at your phone, not looking at your computer. You want your brain to go into a completely different mode, and something light and physical is what you need in that phase. And your brain will then creatively, subconsciously, effectively work on solutions to the problems you've been and consolidate knowledge. So that's what the release phase is. So I would always recommend to somebody who's doing, say, a study day to do something like 90-minute working block and then 30-minute release phase, go for a walk, and then go back for another 90-minute block. You're probably not going to be able to do more than, 3 90-minute blocks is a seriously good effort. People I know will try and study for more, but there is massive diminishing returns. But that's the release phase. And then there's the flow phase, which kind of speaks for itself. That's when, your brain is in a very powerful, focused, almost effortless decision-making state. And then there's the recovery phase, which is different from the release phase. That's where we replenish, particularly neurochemicals like norepinephrine and dopamine, which are essential in flow. Sleep is the most obvious method of recovery, but things like sauna, massage, unfortunately, TV is not, nor is lager. These, they're very specific protocols which are shown to regenerate those neurochemicals. Cold plunge is another positive one. So yeah, but to come back to Julian's question, I think once you start having this practice, you start to develop a greater awareness. It's interesting. It's a bit, by way of analogy, it's a bit like what Julian said before about stopping looking at your EV as frequently. You start to just develop a greater awareness, and I think that's a really powerful skill. Feeling your mind is working differently, feeling your body is operating differently is a real skill, and it actually helps bring a mindfulness and awareness to your decision making. So that's another way I think the release phase helps. You just start to develop an awareness of where your mind is, even if it's an extremely relaxed brainwave state. Incidentally, an example of the release phase, Albert Einstein used to go out onto Lake Geneva to fish after he did his hard work in the lab. And although it wasn't something he was aware of, was the release phase, that was not a concept that existed. He was definitely aware that he was getting a lot of insights when he did that. And effectively, he was doing something light and physical, also in nature, by the way, which is a flow trigger. And he was getting a lot of insights when he did that. So that's the value of the release phase. So great question, Julian. Thank you. Anybody else got any other questions? Okay, any suggestions to address procrastination issues? Thanks, Andrea. Right, so the biggest source of procrastination is subconscious. And there's all sorts of reasons behind it. And I wouldn't want to prejudge any one person's source of procrastination. The answer usually comes out in hypnotherapy. Sometimes it's a fear of failure. It's if you procrastinate. Okay, I can give you an example I can think of. I've worked with a client who constantly put off deliberate practice, study. Very bright, otherwise very hardworking, but put off study. But it was clear that once we did hypnotherapy, that there was a mental program which went back to childhood and actually manifested itself in school exams, where it was almost you wanted to have an excuse. This person wanted to have an excuse for failure, so they didn't try as hard as they might have done at school. And they had the excuse that, well, I didn't try, that's why I didn't get the top marks. And that was something which could be unraveled and was unraveled as a result of hypnotherapy. So I would say that would be the first thing I would try. I mean, you can use for sure other tools at a conscious level. So the big one I would say is the number one tool proven by behavioral psychology and goal achievement is cue-based planning. And cue-based planning is a sort of rather fancy way of describing what is, by and large, a schedule. So, again, I know I hit a lot of resistance from this from poker players, because they say, I don't like the idea of a schedule. I didn't play poker to have a schedule. But the truth of the matter is, if somebody's a procrastinator, the best thing they can do is actually use a schedule. And there's huge amounts of evidence out there that actually using a schedule and saying, hey, if you've got something you want to achieve, put it in this time in the diary. But I have to say that on its own does not do the job quite often. And that is because of the subconscious program. And that's why I would definitely recommend hypnotherapy for procrastination. So, yeah. I'm getting some questions in. So thanks for the question, Andrea. If you want to come back on that, by all means do. Okay, so looks like I've got a question from Alex on Thinking Fast and Slow. It's definitely worth reading. Yeah, I think that's great reading. What else would I read? I'm just reminding myself of the books behind me. Let me see. I tell you what, I am a big fan of Tools of Titans by Tim Ferriss. Lots of interesting ideas in there. Mindset, Carol Dweck is a bit of a classic. The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf Dobelli is kind of covers the same ground to some degree, or as Thinking Fast and Slow, but I'd say if anything, it's an easier read. So I definitely recommend that. By the way, this I talked about this one here, Good Anxiety, Dr. Wendy Suzuki. She's really excellent, and it kind of taps into the same themes I talked about before about how you can leverage anxiety as a positive. Yes, Boundless. I mean, as a physical fitness manual. Well, not just physical fitness, mental fitness. Boundless is excellent. So yeah, definitely recommend that. This book I think is hugely influential for anybody, Homecoming, for anybody who is working within hypnotherapy. It's all about the idea of the impact of our childhood and the need to often deal with childhood issues. So that's one I'd highly recommend. It's a little bit less, a little bit more off the beaten track, but I recommend that. Let me just go back. Julianne says, yeah, I got the same over very difficult math problems early in school. Yeah, I mean, and that's, by the way, it's a really common pattern. I mean, amongst, I had a bit of that at school as well. In fact, quite a lot of it. It was like, why try hard? I mean, part of it is just pure laziness. But I think there's also an element of, look, I don't want to try hard and not succeed. And then the question is where that comes from. So Tristan says procrastination is more linked to self-sabotage. Well, in a sense, that's kind of what I'm saying here. I mean, fear of failure is a kind of self-sabotage because it stops us sometimes playing to win. We just hold back. Let me just scroll down. Grit. Yeah, Grit. Angela Duckworth, great book. Really like Angela Duckworth. She actually talks a lot about deliberate practice, which I touched on earlier. This is a really important concept, if you're going to make the most of your poker study. And yeah, Tristan, yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Okay, great question, Julian, because I think Julian's asked, with regression techniques, how do you safeguard against potential false memories, creating false positives in general? Is this a real danger? It is a danger if the practitioner tries to implant memories. You'll notice before I said, I was very careful to say about procrastination that I don't know exactly where it comes from when Andrea asked the question. You can talk about, I've given an example of where it can come from, but it can come from multiple sources. And I think a skillful practitioner using regression leaves it completely open-ended. They leave it for the clients to find out what the memories are. Then the question becomes, well, okay, are those memories correct? Are our memories accurate? The answer to that is almost, in most cases, unimportant. If that person has that memory, even if it's not entirely correct, even if their memory is colored by all sorts of things which may have distorted it, it still feels real to that person. But what is super important is that the practitioner does not implant the memory. The practitioner does not start leading the witness, as it were. You have to basically create the space for your clients to have their memories. And in fact, what I will do is most of the time then ask the client to interpret the memory, to basically go back to saying what they think about it, how they would advise their younger self. That's really important. The client uses their own wisdom to draw what they want from that memory, rather than, again, you steaming straight in as the coach, as the hypnotherapist, saying, hey, that means you should do this. Now, sometimes some clients need a little bit of helping with drawing conclusions, but in my view, you should never be forcing or suggesting that certain things happen. That is wrong. And in fact, that has been the source of real problems, in another context, sort of, I think there's been a lot of controversy about people having memories in regression of sexual abuse, for example. It's vital that the practitioner does not start implanting memories. But I would say that whatever the context, you must always just allow the client's memories to bubble up, just the way they remember them. And to be honest with you, you can go down, for example, what I will sometimes do is we'll discuss a particular issue. Let's imagine it was procrastination. I might spend some time with the client just discussing how procrastination manifests itself for them. We'll do some conscious level planning around it. We'll discuss it. I'll then say to the client, okay, can you remember procrastinating earlier in your life? And we'll have a general discussion. But all I'm really doing there is preparing the way for their minds. Their subconscious mind will already be working on, we're talking about procrastination. And then I'll go into a session where it will just be, okay, you're gonna basically go and visit some memories, and it will be completely open-ended. I might have the client walking into a room and they will see exactly what they see. I won't have any inkling or suggestion as to what they're going to find in that room. Even if they've told me about incidents in their childhood, I will specifically step back and let them see what they see in the room. Because often it's something which isn't even what they've talked about. So yeah, it's a great question, and it's definitely something which you have to be very careful with as a practitioner. It's very easily avoided as long as you have that awareness. I think some practitioners sometimes a client will come to you as well and say, I think I know where this all comes from. And even then I will just say, well, okay, fine, but I will still use a technique which does not immediately say, okay, go back to that memory. I will try and use a technique which just allows the memories to flow. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Julian? Great. Anybody got any other questions?
Yeah, I actually think that was great.
Yeah, great. Well,
great and awesome session. Helped me personally a lot, and I guess for the others as well.
Yeah, and thank you everybody. Some really great questions, by the way. You know, both today live and also in the channel. Actually, you know, you hit some really big issues, and I'm really glad about that last question, by the way, because I know that's something that people are concerned about. One thing I would say is that for me, regression therapy was an absolute game changer. It actually was. It was a life changer, to be honest with you. But you know, I absolutely understand why people are like, okay, you know, I want to make sure that somebody isn't playing with my mind here. So I'm really glad that question was asked. So thank you.
Awesome. Then thanks for your time.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you all. And well, I will see you all next month.
Yes.
Okay then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.